Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Roberts, the Executive Director of the American Mathematical Society, and I'm here today to introduce Jordan Ellenberg. Jordan Ellenberg is a recipient of the 2023 JPBM Communications Award. This is called the Joint Policy Board for Mathematics. It's an organization that consists of the AMS, the American Math Society, the American Statistical Association, the Mathematical Association of America, and the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics. And JPBM gives this award each year to reward and encourage communicators who on a sustained basis bring mathematical ideas and information to non-mathematical audiences. Dr. Ellenberg's award is for his clear and entertaining prose that brings the power and beauty of mathematics to a general audience. Dr. Ellenberg earned his PhD at Harvard. His research centers on the fields of number theory and algebraic geometry. In 2004, he joined the faculty at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he is now the John D. MacArthur Professor of Mathematics. He's held an NSF Career Grant and an Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship. In 2013, he was named a Fellow of the AMS. In 2015, he was named a Guggenheim Fellow, and in 2018, a Simons Fellow. Dr. Ellenberg has been writing for a general audience about mathematics for more than 15 years. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Wired, The Believer, and the Boston Globe. You may know him as the author of the Do the Math column in Slate. His 2014 book, How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking, as well as his 2021 book, Shape, The Hidden Geometry of Information, Biology, Strategy, Democracy, and Everything Else, were both New York Times bestsellers. So please join me in welcoming Jordan to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Well, thank you so much for coming at almost the end of what has been like an incredible joint meeting. As Catherine just told me, there have been 2,000 talks here. I kind of feel like I went to 2,000 talks already, and maybe you guys too. So thank you for coming to number 2001. I appreciate that at the end of a long week. So yeah, this talk, first of all, obviously the one thing I want to start with is just by expressing my gratefulness to the board for awarding me this prize. It's like really great to sort of be recognized for this kind of work, which maybe traditionally is not so much thought of as part of the working life as a mathematician. And in some sense, I think the goal of this talk is to sort of try to make a pitch for the idea that this is really part of the working life of a mathematician and is sort of continuous with many of the other things we do in our mathematical life. And my sort of organizing slogan is the title of this talk, Outward-Facing Math, something I want to encourage among people and figure out how to help people do, since I sort of accidentally stumbled into doing it myself. So, to start with, if you have a conversation with other mathematicians, a lot of the time, I'm sure you guys have been in this conversation, right, where there's a complaint about the way mathematics is seen by the rest of the world that's not here, the world that's not in this room, like the world outside mathematics. And the idea that there's a kind of caricature of what math is. So here, I used one of these automatic image generators to generate this, but the quality is not that different from what you might actually see in the newspaper. Oh, who are we? We're the people who think a coffee cup is the same as a donut. That's one vision of also sort of demographically, you can kind of see like who the mathematician is by the way that this image generator tends to produce when you ask it to show a mathematician. That's sort of one vision that doesn't really sort of like reflect exactly how we see ourselves. Another would be, this is a crazy novel that was actually written by one of the candidates for governor of Wisconsin a few years back, but I should have actually written down the sort of back copy of this book, but it's very hilarious, but it's like sort of about a kid who's a math prodigy and he sort of has some like immensely good factoring algorithm and everybody's trying to hunt him down and it's a thriller and like, but this is another vision where, oh, the mathematician is some kind of bizarre kind of person set apart from the ordinary with special powers, like almost not quite a normal human. And that's also not how we see ourselves, right? But would we agree, like that's also sort of like a commonly presented vision of what math does? And so we sit around and we complain and we say like, why is the vision of mathematics that is presented in the public, to the extent that there is a vision presented at all, why is it so different from what we know from our own lives as mathematicians, whether we're professors or students or teachers or whatever our role is in this field? And so, of course, there's a very simple thing we can do about this, which is to tell stories ourselves. And I want to sort of talk today about sort of how that might be done and how I've done it. So let me just, I'll sort of go from like the negative to the positive and say that we are, to be honest, in actually kind of a golden age of math popularization. This slide, actually, I just put in at the last minute because I went to Karen Parshall's very interesting talk about the history of math on the radio, which made me realize that, I say we're in a golden age of math popularization, but mass broadcasting of math is not so new, as I learned from this talk yesterday. So I quickly put in this slide about the Adventures in Science radio broadcast, which I learned yesterday from Karen, like featured like lots of mathematicians shooting stuff out on the radio. Here's my co-winner, the amazing 3 blue, 1 brown. So this is another venue, this kind of very popular YouTube channel, and it's not the only one. We use podcasts, like Evelyn and Kevin's wonderful podcast, My Favorite Theorem. And of course, there's Math Talk. Does everybody know what this is? Okay, this just means like TikToks that are about math. So this is like hashtag Math Talk, and you can find everybody. I don't know if Alvaro Lozano Robledo is here, but my number theory colleague, who is kind of a king of Math Talk, actually, although he's not, I don't have a picture of him on this slide. So I tried to show you a sort of range of things because I think of them according to this curve, which is important. So let me sort of take a moment to talk about this curve. And when we talk about how we show what math is to other people, there's a kind of basic trade-off that the more time we have with the person we're trying to talk to somebody about math, the fewer people we're going to reach. And so there's this kind of inverse curve, which I drew a very scientific diagram of that you can see here, where on one end of it, there's a relationship that like I would have with one of my PhD students, where I've got them for like 5 years, right? And they talk to me a lot, and we go like very deep. But I can only do that for one person at a time. And at the other end of the scale, there's something like radio or going on national TV, where like literally millions or even tens of millions of people are going to see you, but the amount of time you have and the amount of information you can convey is incredibly small. I wasn't going to say this, but maybe we're all friends here, right? So in this respect, you can see me on The Price is Right next week, January 18th, in prime time. I just thought I would mention that. I wasn't going to say it, but since I put national TV on the slide, I will say I will be on national TV playing The Price is Right. And actually, I'm going to go with that, actually, because what can you convey? Am I on The Price is Right, like giving a math lecture? I am not. But here's actually a fact about math that we can teach people, that there are mathematicians like who are alive right now and are not like dead people in robes from ancient Greece, right? You got to know that people don't know that. Like most people do not know that a mathematician is a thing that a human being can be in 2022. So literally just being on a game show and being identified as a mathematician, I actually consider that like a piece of outward-facing math with like a very small amount of time expended and a very small amount of information conveyed, but potentially a very large reach. All right, so I talked about the two outermost parts of this curve, but kind of a lot of stuff that we do is on this curve somewhere. So what we do in the classroom, if I'm in front of 40 or 80 or 100 students, I have a little bit less time with them than I do with one of my PhD students. But I have, I can make them do homework. There's a reasonable amount of hours that we spend together, and then instead of one person at a time, I can do dozens of people at a time. And then sort of in the middle is what I'm going to talk about mostly today, things like writing books and writing articles. Those are kind of intermediate between what we can do in the classroom and what we can do in like 2 seconds of being on TV. But maybe the point of this curve is just to sort of make my claim that there is a continuity between what we do when we think we're being professors, when we think we're being teachers, and what we do when we perhaps experiment with writing or presenting or YouTubing for the public. So, okay, I talked to a lot of people who are interested in doing some form of math popularization. And in some sense, maybe this might literally be the most important slide I have today, which is just to say that there is no official way to do this. There's sort of no credential of being a math popularizer, which is, on the one hand, like a little confusing, because it's sort of not so obvious like what you should sort of sit down and start doing, but it's also liberating in that like you start doing it just by starting to do it. So that's one thing I mean, I want to be encouraging about this, that if you feel like you want to tell your story in some public way, you just do it. You just do it, and no one can stop you, and then you're doing it. And I'll talk more. Now, that's both encouraging, but also sort of logistically useless. So I am going to say like a little bit more about what I think are effective techniques as we go. Okay, so I talked about the continuity between our work lives as mathematicians and this kind of popularization that I do. And I really want to emphasize that one thing I've come to see over a lot of time, first writing articles and then writing books, is that this mission really is pretty continuous with my classroom mission. It feels like the same kind of thing, and I'll sort of say this, again, as a way of being encouraging, since I know many folks in the room are teaching, that I feel like writing books and writing articles actually enriches my classroom teaching a lot. I mean, this kind of like rigorous training in storytelling and narrative that you have to sort of like undergo to write, when we teach, we're telling stories too, right? So it sort of feels, it feels a little bit the same. And actually, there's sort of two aspects of teaching which are also aspects of writing that I really want to emphasize. Two words which I think probably feel a little bit different to most people, but I think they're strongly allied. So the first bullet point here is empathy. That when we teach, and also when we write, there's one absolutely critical thing that we have to do, which is that we have some idea or some concept or some technicality or some piece of mathematics that we want to convey, and we have to imagine ourselves into the mind of the person who doesn't already know that. It sounds trivial, but it is really sort of like the most important thing you can do. And we have to do it as a teacher too, right? We have to do it in our classroom. We have to be like, what is it like to not know the thing that I know that I'm about to talk about? Without that, it's actually very hard to be an effective teacher. And I want to claim that sort of same skill is sort of what you have to do to get down words on the page too. And by the way, probably the same is true if you were like making YouTube videos, which Grant knows how to do and I don't know how to do. I mean, I'm talking about writing today because that's the format that I know very well, but probably a lot of what I say generalizes. So empathy sounds good, right? We all like empathy? Yes? Okay, good. I feel like general. Empathy. Okay. Oh, I thought you were going to denounce empathy. Okay, no, that's good. Maybe marketing sounds bad, but I think both of these are good, actually. I mean, I think that, again, in the classroom, I mean, wouldn't it be great if we were like so clear that all people had to do is sort of show up and listen to us talk, and then they would understand everything? Yeah, that would be great, but that's not. I mean, math is harder than that, right? That's not how it works. Our students in the classroom are going to need to put in a fair amount of time, like working problems, looking at their notes, thinking over what we said, letting it sit in their minds. We have to convince them that it's a good idea to spend that time doing that. We have to convince them that it's going to be worth it. And that is, I mean, I would call that marketing, right? We are sort of salespeople in the classroom. And I think quite simply, one way we do that is just by letting the intrinsic enthusiasm we have for the material show to the extent that we can. Like to sort of be like, we're excited to be here. We feel like it's worth it. Hopefully you will too. if we don't do that, we can't ask our students to meet us and do the extra work. And I think this is true of writing as well. There, I think the marketing aspect is like much more direct, right? If you're selling a book, you're like literally asking people to exchange money for your words. But again, I think that the key is that you are trying to make people feel it's worth it to spend the time with you, both in our teaching and in our writing. And I think those two things are what make these two activities feel continuous to me. So let me say a few things. Again, this is actually sort of related to our teaching too, because those of us who are teachers, I'm just going to say it, we spend a lot of time in rooms with students who have not chosen to be there with us. That's true, right? Absolutely. Yes, I mean that's, and obviously all of us here, we make the best of it and we try to make it a good experience, but it can be, that sort of part of our life can make us forget that actually people are really hungry to learn about math. So maybe this is something that people really don't know, that if you are like, man, I want to write an op-ed, I want to write a feature article, I want to write a book, but it's such a heavy lift to get people to care about math. I can tell you from sort of my world and my sort of life in commercial publishing, that is not true, and people are actually really eager to hear about this stuff. So I'm just being very crass and commercial, but people want it. And so the reason I put this particular slide, this was an article I wrote a few years ago in Slate about Yitang Zhang's amazing theorem about bounded gaps. And I wrote this article because it was such a cool advance, and it was such a rare opportunity to sort of write about something that was happening in research number theory, which mostly is not what I do, but because there was aspects of it that I thought would sort of were quite accessible to a general audience. And to my surprise, this was the most popular thing I ever wrote on Slate. And I've written lots of articles for them, and they're usually sort of in the vein of something that has to do with this week's news, or something that sort of felt more like, oh, this is what people want, news you can use. But no, this thing, which was about prime numbers, was by far the most popular thing I ever wrote. So believe that people actually want to know, because they really do. On the other hand, they're still not interested in math in the same way that we are. So so this is one thing I was thinking, again, to sort of emphasize the continuity between our sort of our math life and writing life. You may have heard this advice that if you're giving a talk about your research work, what you are really excited about is lemma 6.24. Right? You worked really hard on it, and that was a sticking point. You came to understand that the real difficulty, everything came down to lemma 6.24. And yes, it's kind of complicated, and there's sort of 6 cases, and you're but that's what I really want to talk about. But no, of course, you don't ever, ever talk about lemma 6.24. In your talk, you should sort of talk about the main ideas, the ideas that are going to resonate with the person who has not thought deeply enough about your exact problem to understand why lemma 6.24 is the key. And I think popular writing is a lot like that too. That, for instance, when I wrote about Yitang Zhang, I certainly did not in any way attempt to give some sense of how Zhang did what he did. But by the way, I also didn't just write about the kind of interesting human story of Yitang Zhang's sort of unusual career arc, which is certainly interesting, but is somehow not mathematical. I wrote instead about the question of why people thought there should be bounded gaps in the first place. Because that's very accessible. The idea that we can think of prime numbers as somehow randomly strewn, and that if we think of it like that, it's actually not surprising at all that there should be bounded gaps, and it's what people should expect. That was what I wrote about, because I wanted to convey that mathematicians often believe things before they're proven. Right? I think that's something that people don't know, right? They think we sort of are little robots who sort of don't have any beliefs or feelings like until a proof is written down, at which point we believe something. And so I think there's stuff we can write that is truly mathematical and is truly conveying something about the actual world of math, but is not Lemma 6.24, and is also not just a sort of a general human interest story that has no mathematical content at all. That, I think, is the sweet spot for us. Partly because like a regular person who's not in this room, like a regular journalist can write the human interest story, but there's certain stories that only we can tell, and that's where I think our special ability to add value is. Okay, here's a question I get a lot, and this is actually, it feeds in very nicely. The question is like, but aren't we dumbing down mathematics by talking about it in a public venue? And I really want to, this is like one of my least favorite expressions. As I once heard Sarah say about a piece of notation he didn't like, I put it on the board only in order to object to it. So what I would say is we are definitely not dumbing down, but what we are doing is making intelligent choices about what stories to tell. So I'll say, I'm constantly thinking about, there's some sort of exciting advance, like some exciting theorem proved. And honestly, most of the stuff that was reported about at this conference would not make a good article in the Washington Post, would not make a good spot on a TV program or on NPR, would not sort of make a good center of a book. But the good news is there's so much math that we can find stories that do work for a non-technical audience, an audience of people who were not math majors, who do not have advanced degrees, but are curious and interested. Those stories are there, but I think we have to let, but I do think we have to let that drive us. That we should tell the stories that can be well told to that audience and not insist that because Lemma 6.24 is what we care about most, we have to find a way to tell that story. Because even within that, there's a huge range. Here, I'll just show you 4 books I like. There's a huge range of kinds of stories we can tell. Actually, Eugenia, who is, I think she's around this week, right? I haven't run into her yet. I remember getting this book in the mail, How to Bake Pie, and being like, I think maybe somebody emailed me and was like, do you want to see a copy of this? And I was like, that's an insane idea. That is not going to work. And then it totally works. So if you have seen this book, it's like Eugenia being like, I think I want to explain what category is through the medium of baking. And it's a very strange idea. She wouldn't mind that I say that. But it completely works. So that's one kind of thing. I'm aflame with passion for category theory, and I want to share that with people. Then you have somebody like Nate Silver, who is not here, sort of talking about truly mathematical ideas, but through the lens of these ideas about prediction. So this is sort of a more traditional, let me take a thing that people really know they care about, like playing poker, making predictions about sports, and making predictions about elections. I guess probably most people now know his name is an election guy, but he has a long history as a sports prediction guy and a poker playing guy, and then before that a burrito rating guy, which is largely what this book is about. And then you have Ben, who just likes drawing funny pictures, and Michael, who's also around this week, Michael Harris, who's telling a completely different set of stories, in some sense talking about talking about the practice of mathematics and the sociology of the sort of strange profession that we're all in. These are 4 wildly varying kinds of stories, but what they all have in common is that they're stories that you can really get something out of without being a professional mathematician or even a math student. So I actually find that sort of thinking about stuff that you can write for a broad audience is not that limiting at all. There's a gigantic range of stuff we can do. And fundamentally, this is the thing that I think we always have to remember. I'm just going to say this because I think it's important. Math is a human activity that human beings do, and we do it for human purposes. So, to be honest, I think what is, this is something that I think often people don't know about math. Right? Our students, I think often think that math is something we invented just to make 10th grade less pleasant. And that is something I think we can truly all convey, that every single thing that we ask students to do was devised by people to do something that people wanted to do. So that's one reason that when I write, I often sort of do historical stuff. I often sort of try to go back. Right? This goes back to the issue of empathy. If you want to sort of really put yourself in contact with what would it be like not to know this, a very easy way is to go back to when the concept was devised. Because then people didn't know it, and they were devising the concept in order to do something. And I think people find that very, very motivating. And I think this is one of the most important things that we can convey to people outside this room, that we're not sort of like robotically calculating or moving pieces around on a game board, that we are people like doing things that people want to do. Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about a particular project that I'm really interested in. And it starts with this, because, I mean, I've said a few things about what I think works in math popularization, but fundamentally, what makes math writing good is the same thing as what makes any kind of writing good. In fact, maybe I'll sort of say one more thing about Nate Silver, who I admire a lot, because my parents are statisticians. I don't know if you guys know that. So I have a lot and in the statistics community, I'm just going to say it, there's like a fair amount of grumbling about Nate Silver. In the following sense, that we're like, what this guy's doing is like completely obvious. Like, he's not doing anything like sort of super advanced or like difficult, or like, why is this guy so famous? Like, why is he paid? Like, do you guys know how much Nate Silver gets paid when he goes and gives a talk at a corporation or something, by the way? Am I allowed to say this? $65,000. I found that out recently. No, I mean, so he's like a very famous, like well-compensated guy. And I think people do feel like, well, what is, this guy doesn't have any special sauce. He does what like any statistics major undergraduate would do in trying to understand how to predict elections. And I'm just going to say, quite frankly, the reason Nate Silver is who he is because he's a good writer, because he writes about it very effectively and like writes good sentences that kind of snap, that like people want to read. And writing, like math, is actually kind of a difficult skill filled with technicalities that you have to learn with a lot of practice. And so I don't know, this didn't actually come up in Catherine's introduction, but maybe to say something about my own background. Before I went to grad school in math, I went to grad school in creative writing to see if I wanted to be a novelist. And it turns out being a novelist sucks. I don't know if you know that. It was very depressing, and every day I missed math. Actually, okay, are there any other undergrads in the room? Okay, undergrads, I do want to say, doing something else before you go to grad school in math is great, because then you'll learn that like things that are not math like really suck in certain ways. And then when you go to grad school and grad school sucks, you'll be like, you know what sucks more than this? Not being in grad school. But so knowing that was very useful, but also it sort of turned out that what I learned when I was in grad school in creative writing was also incredibly useful, because grad school in creative writing is grad school, and you do spend like a lot of time like really like working like really hard on growing certain skills, which I feel like sort of by accident I've ended up using a lot in my role of like writing articles and writing books. So I want to talk about a project I did this last year in 2022, and that I'm going to do again, which is kind of experimental, because since people talk to me all the time, especially like young people, about like, well, how can I get started in this area? And I always say like, well, to write good public math or public science generally, you got to be a good writer. That's what you have to do. I was like, well, what if we took the mechanism by which we teach writing to people who want to be novelists, which is called the workshop. Has anybody in this room been in a workshop, like a creative writing workshop? Not very many people, but some. Okay, so there is this kind of standard mode that works pretty well, and I wanted to experiment with doing this with a group of early career scientists, like treating their manuscripts, like treating their popular science the way we would treat a short story or a poem in workshop. And actually, it succeeded beyond my expectations. I mean, largely because like the students were sort of so incredibly great and devoted. And so what I want to sort of like devote the last part of this talk to talking about is just some of the things I learned from running this workshop, which I think are like really useful. So, one key thing as we write, I think an interesting question I won't talk about today, by the way, but we can talk about it after, is how much does this apply to writing those of us who are writing research papers, how much does this apply to our research papers? I think it's different, but has certain commonalities. But this is like a key thing that we found ourselves doing all the time, to ask every word what work it's doing. Here's a sentence that was taken from something somebody wrote in our group. This was about, as you can imagine, sort of about like various like AI models. You can't really escape the proliferation of these models in your everyday life. This is sort of like a normal sentence that you can easily, can't you imagine yourself writing this sentence or like reading it? But when you look at it, what is the word really doing? Probably not very much. It's sort of an intensifier, I guess, but it's almost, probably more than anything else, it's just kind of a throat clearing. I think the sentence says the same thing without it. And so let's get rid of it. Let's try getting rid of it. Let's look at that sentence a little more. Actually, maybe I should actually make this an audience participation moment. Does anybody else want to like interrogate any words? That's what I was going to do. Who said proliferation? What's wrong with it? Yeah, we don't. I think we don't need it. And what's more, it's not just that we don't need it, is that it doesn't actually say what you think it says. Because think about it. Are you escaping the proliferation? No. What are you trying to escape? The models, right? So this is not just an unnecessary word. It's actually a word that is kind of getting in the way of the sentence actually saying what it says. I feel like when we read it, we kind of just read past it. We sort of read it as saying, you can't escape these models, and by the way, they're proliferating. But it's actually good when sentences sort of say what they say and don't require you to do that kind of extra work. So let's get rid of that, because what it's saying is we can't escape the models, and if we want to say they're proliferating, like let's say that in another sentence or something like this. God, I'm not even needed. You guys did this for me. Yeah. So the other thing I would say is that's just kind of like verbiage. Now, by the way, so like literally, I think you can't escape these models is a much punchier, more powerful sentence that says essentially the same thing. Now, by the way, in your everyday life, I think what would be good is to use the space we saved by doing these cuts for an example of something in your everyday life, but a specific thing, rather than just sort of vaguely saying in your everyday life. So I don't mean to say that we all have to kind of like Ernest Hemingway ourselves into writing extremely unadorned sentences with like no flourish or anything like that. This particular one ends up being kind of like a short declarative sentence. They certainly don't have to be, but I think every single one of us, when we sit down to write something, even though I've been doing this kind of thing for like 20 years, everybody's first drafts has like lots of stuff that just doesn't need to be there. And I think the single most important thing that we worked on in this workshop is just like learning how to read in a way. When we read, probably people who are in the academic world in some respect, we all read pretty fast, right? And reading fast kind of inherently means like reading not very carefully, like not reading every word. If you read every word, like that's slow. But to read your own work and edit it and make it good, you actually have to untrain yourself from the kind of quick skimming reflex that serves us very well as college students or graduate students or researchers trying to like scan the literature, and train ourselves to like sort of read closely and quizzically and maybe even kind of adversarially, like to our own words, being like, which ones can I throw away? So we did a lot of this in our workshop together, and that's a skill that I feel like we can all build. So actually, Maria Jackerson, who I don't know if she has a wonderful YouTube channel about work-life balance in math, which I definitely want to. So the way she put it, when I asked everybody to sort of like write, evaluations of what they learned, was that, okay, are there any actual Russian people who want to say this for me in the room? I'm going to say it really badly if I try. Yemkost? How'd I do? Okay, I know what that means because I read A Clockwork Orange. Okay. Yeah, Yemkost is great, and she wrote that, and I was like, what does that mean? And she was like, you can't really say it in English, and I was like, great. But she said it kind of means like a lot of meaning in a small space. And I do think that's what we're going for. I mean, I will say the thing we were focusing on in this workshop is the 1,000-word piece. And 1,000 words is really short. And so this kind of packing a lot into a small space is like exactly what we're most trying to do. So let me say another thing that is not about concision, and that I think is often something we don't naturally do, which is that the author should be present. This ties in with the idea that math is about people and human activities. And this again, in many ways, like a lot of what we learned in this workshop was like how to unlearn habits that serve us very well in our academic lives, right? So the first thing I said was like reading fast and skimming serves us well. We have to unlearn that. We also learn to remove ourselves from what we write, right? We all write like we in our papers. We never write I. We tend to write, and I think probably the tendency of most people inside a scientific community when we write about science to try to write, I call it the floating head. Like as if we're just like a floating head that like is not a person and is kind of seeing everything the way an omniscient narrator sees it. And that's probably mostly not what we should do because it removes from us an ability to make a connection. So I try to be more specific. This is very vague. So for instance, here's a thing. I think I took out the actual words, but a sentence that came up in a piece that we discussed was, one might think of whatever as a form of whatever. And what's weird about this? Well, first of all, the one, like who is one? Like some unnamed person, or maybe even an abstraction of a person. Definitely not me or you. We wouldn't want to like get weird and like talk about. So there's a sort of distancing, right, where we feel like very separated from what's going on. And then we can't even say that, right? We can't even though we said one, we can't say one thinks of. We're like, well, no, one might. I'm not saying one does. That would be too aggressive and weird. Okay, so that's a very natural habit that we learn as academics to kind of like separate ourselves and avoid feeling like we're just saying something that might actually express my personal opinion or an opinion that you might have. But no, we got to get past that. And instead, let me sort of tell you like two other ways we could sort of convey the same thing. You can say, you could think of X as a Y. Here, by the way, I said the author should be present in the piece. But this is sort of putting the reader into the piece. It's a trick, I'm going to be honest with you. I mean, it's like the reader is not actually there with you while you're writing it. But you want the reader to feel addressed, and this kind of second-person address is very useful. Here, by the way, I am softening a little bit. I wouldn't say you should think of X as a Y, because that does feel kind of aggressive. You're just saying you can, if you want to. Or if you really want to sort of go for it, you can just say, think of X as a Y. Now the word you is gone, but it's still implicitly there, right? It's still implicitly a second person address. When you say either of these things, especially the second one really both people are there. That's saying, I'm here talking to you, counseling you to do something. I'm going to use the back button. Doesn't that feel incredibly different from this, even though you might think of it as conveying the same idea? So that's something, again, that where you don't have the habit of doing, we have to unlearn our habits and be more direct in our address and try to write pieces where the experience of reading the piece feels like I'm there and you're there and we're talking about it, and I'm not afraid to kind of just like go up to you and tell you something, stating it directly. Maybe I'll tell a little story because I think I have time, which is that one thing about the books that I write is that they have these incredibly cruddy drawings that I made. You saw an example of that curve that I drew of like what my drawings look like. When I was writing the first book, I was sort of making all these drawings as kind of placeholders, and my idea was like, okay, well I have to like draw these kind of mock-ups of what they're going to look like, and then sort of like find an artist to make the actual art for the book. But I don't know any artists, right? I'm a mathematician, like that's who I hang out with, like I sort of, okay, well I know one artist. Do you guys know who Linda Barry is? Anybody? Okay, good. In a just world, all of you would yell woo when I said Linda Barry. One of the great cartoonists of the modern world, and my colleague on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin, and the only artist I know, because she's my colleague at Wisconsin, and I asked her, like, do you know, like, people in town who I could, like, hire to, like, draw the pictures for me? And she kind of became, like, very cold and haughty, and she was like, would you pay somebody to write the words for you? And I was like, oh, no. And she was like, this is you. Like, if you let somebody else do the drawings, you're not there. And she was completely right, and I think it changed the way the book worked, because those sort of cruddy napkin-type drawings really, I think, I only understood this afterwards, you know, it really makes the reader feel like they're just there with me. Like, we're together, and the reason this picture looks the way it looks is that I just, like, ripped out a piece of paper from my notebook and, like, drew it on the spot. And so I think that kind of intimacy is something, yeah, I should put intimacy on the slide. That's a good word for this. We are not trained to write with intimacy, right, when we write academically. But I think for popular writing, like, we need to kind of unlearn our habits and do that. Okay. One more thing I found when working with these pieces is that a lot of times I felt like I realized that what was concerning about a piece wasn't so much something about an individual word choice or an individual sentence, but that the piece hadn't actually decided, like, what it was trying to do. We actually had a long list. These are probably the most three common things of, like, you know, a piece that is trying to explain something is actually really a different thing from a piece that is trying to persuade you to believe something, which is different from a piece that is trying to persuade you to do something, which is different from a piece that is trying to debunk something that it thinks you might actually believe that's wrong, or something like that. And I think often what I found that I hadn't anticipated is that we would read a piece where somehow it seemed like maybe, like, the whole piece was explaining and then the concluding paragraph was persuading or something like that, and we were like, let's actually think about why you're asking people to read this. And this is particularly important in the short magazine piece, because there's frankly just not room to do more than that. So this, again, is different from our academic writing, where if we read a paper, we really maybe want to, like, maybe there are sort of like three ideas that sort of go together, and so we want to put them all in. Or even in writing a book, where you can really kind of stretch out and sort of go on digressions and do all kinds of different things. For something like the short, let's say, 1,000-word newspaper op-ed or magazine article, which is where I would counsel anybody to start if they're interested in doing stuff like this, there is just not room to do more than one thing. Even if the other things are relevant, even if the other things are important, I think it's extremely important to figure out what the goal is and figure out how to get in, do it, and get out, which is about as much as you can do in 1,000 words. I think this is the last example I want to talk about, and I bring this up. This is another sentence from my workshop. A lot of times we worry about jargon, right? Like, sort of using jargon that sort of is off-putting to people, or just sort of makes their eyes glaze over. This is actually a little bit different, because I think, for instance, the word microbiome is not so much the problem here. I actually think the more of the problem are things like community or suspend. I think one thing so in other words, like, we know which words are specific math words, right? We know that if I were writing the article for Washington Post, I wouldn't use the word cohomology in it. But what I think takes a little bit more thought on our part is that there's lots of words that are just regular English words that we use in our own way. And that actually has the potential to confuse much more. Like, somebody who reads this and doesn't know what the microbiome will know that that's a word that they don't know, and they don't know what it means. Whereas, like, community is here used in a specific way. Suspend is used in a specific way. And so I think we sort of need to, like, be aware of what we're doing. On the other hand, I will say one thing I've learned from writing a lot is that you shouldn't not use internal to science words if you're going to explain them. Because I think one kind of piece that readers love is if they can come away, like, knowing a word that they didn't know and, like, feeling smart. So I mean, I think so as long as it's done in the piece, I think that can actually be good, and I'm not anti-jargon. I'm not even anti-equations in the piece, if you're gonna like really explain like what it is. So we're nearly at the end. I think the next slide is my last one. And I just want to return to this idea of the unity of our mathematical lives. Because in the end, I'm going to say something maybe a little bit provocative. I mean, I'm here very gratefully receiving a prize for mathematical communication. And it can seem like that's something I do when I'm not being a mathematician. And I really, really, if I want to get one point across today, it's that I don't see it that way. I think that is part of my life as a mathematician. And I think I would even go so far as to say that the math that we do that is called mathematics and not mathematics communication is also mathematical communication. Like, ready to say something provocative? I think if we sort of sit at home and like write a really great proof of a theorem and don't tell anybody, and then you like die, I'm not sure you're doing mathematics. I think mathematics is like the community where we like share ideas and like and transmit them from person to person, right? I mean, I know this is a little controversial, but I think in some ways, you know, if you imagine this future, and I'm a big fan of formalization. I hope people went to some of the amazing formalization talks talking about the advances that are taking place in that domain. I sort of think that if it's like 2033 instead of 2023 and sort of somebody's laptop like crunched a long time and produced like a sort of 30 billion character formal proof of the Riemann hypothesis, like, who cares, man? That's not mathematics. Right? I mean, a sort of like human unreadable certification. Come on, we already know the Riemann hypothesis is true. Come on, be honest, we kind of know. So what would we gain? What would we gain if we didn't understand why it was true? Yeah, I'm trying to make people fight with me. Molden's going to fight with me. Okay. I'm just saying the actual practice of mathematics. Everybody should read Thurston's Proof and Progress in Mathematics. You know, don't believe me. Believe Thurston, The Appeal to Authority. The actual process of mathematics is the human community of increasing our understanding, which is only done by people sharing their mathematics with each other. And so I'll just close by saying, like, I feel like, yeah, I'm here being a mathematical communicator for this talk, but I also feel like I'm here being a mathematician as I give this talk, and I hope I've convinced you that that's the case. So thank you guys so much for coming, and again, thanks to the board for this amazing prize.
Thank you so much, Jordan. There are microphones here and here, so if you're interested in asking Jordan a question, if you could kind of line up at the mics, that'd be great. We're going to take a quick picture while I hand him his official certificate award, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
Oh, can I say one more thing, though, before questions, which I meant to say, which is that if you like this idea of the workshop and you want to run one, please come talk to me about it, because I want these things to happen run by people other than me. So if that seems interesting to you, please do talk to me about it, and we can talk about, like, logistically how to get something like this up and running. Okay. All right, where am I coming? Over here?
Hi, may I?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, so you want to just take questions alternating from
Absolutely. Am I calling, or are you calling? Who's calling?
You can call.
Okay.
Hi, can I be heard?
Sure.
Sounds like it. Okay. Jordan, absolutely fantastic talk,
thank
just
you.
fabulous. I'd like to add one additional piece of advice to anyone wanting to improve their writing that I've found to be the case, which is to find yourself a good editor. My writing is always improved by having someone else fix it. And it seems to be always easier to see what's wrong with someone else's writing.
So I agree that it's easier, but I'm going to push back on your pushback and say that
good.
we can never really be
what's
good
a
until we learn
pushback?
to be our own editor. Yes, other people will look at it too, but like,
But it's easier to.
right.
Okay. Well, thank you again.
Right.
Hi, I have a, first of all, I really liked the idea of this talk because I was a math major, but I was also a creative writing minor, and so like just these ideas are like really cool. I feel like whenever I'm like thinking about what, like the weight that a word like needs to carry, I feel like I find myself obsessing over like choosing the right word and kind of like those like perfectionistic tendencies start coming up. So I was wondering like how do you deal with that, right? Like when you're like you want to like make it sort of like the most accessible, but then you just spend a lot of time like sort of like obsessing over that.
I mean, I deal with it by like leaning into it and embracing it, because you should like think very hard about every word. I mean, okay, you're right that there's a limit, right? There's like a limit. I mean, if like you're literally unwilling to ever release your stuff into the world, like that's too much. But I feel like I'm worried I'll make people mad by saying this, but I feel like most people in their writing like should be more perfectionistic than they are. And I think it doesn't come naturally to us. So I mean, you're right that you can overdo it, but I must admit, I'm the guy who like when I write a book, I'm like, they're like, we're trying to go to press, and I'm like, wait, I have another thought about like where I put that comma on like page 172. Can we like revisit that and maybe I'll like move it back from where I like moved it last week? Like I'm that guy. But I think that is writing. Like that is valuable. I guess okay. If I were trying to, but I feel like I'm like not validating your question. So let me sort of answer it another way. If you find it's getting in the way. Like if you find I can't move on because I'm just like up night thinking about this word in this sentence and I can't write the rest of the piece or I can't release it. I mean, this kind of self-editing feature, this fact that what you put on the page is not final for like a long time after you put it on the page is very helpful. Like it's okay to write a bad sentence. There's nothing wrong with that. And the first sentence you write is always going to be bad. And maybe the second version of it is also going to be bad, and so is the third version. And I think that helps, knowing that whatever choice you make, you are going to, for a long time, have the opportunity to revisit it. In my house, I have two teenage kids, and when they're sort of struggling with writing for school, we talk about the shitty first draft. I told them, you're not allowed to say shitty in the house except in the phrase shitty first draft. Like that kind of gets them into it because and you have to have, so you do have to have the freedom, because you can't edit what's not there, right? So I think that's what I would say. But I'll admit it, I don't know, my wife's a therapist, so she'd probably be mad at me for saying this, but like it's, perfectionism, it's to some extent to be tolerated and even encouraged.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk and wonderful writing ideas. So I mean, I don't have the ability to carry out them myself, but I couldn't agree more. But since this is about communication, and you mentioned there are many channels, and there's TV, there's YouTube channel, there's this math talk. If I remember correctly, there are 300 million views. I wonder how many of these ideas are applicable in these other channels, and whether you have some new ideas you would like to share with the audience with respect to these channels.
Yeah, I wish I knew, because I think those channels, I mean, something's right. I work in like a very old medium that's been around for a long time, and I've built a lot of skills in it. If Grant Sanderson were here, like maybe he could tell us. Like I would love to know. Basically, I'm just going to endorse your question without answering it and saying, I would love to know these things that I say that are sort of things that I learned both from the writing workshops I went to as a student and what I'm learning from my students now. I wonder if somebody who makes really good podcasts or really good YouTube videos, or even just like, as a Twitter guy, I can say they definitely apply to tweeting. Right? Like sort of this sort of whole thing of being your own editor. The key, I don't know, do you guys use Twitter? Anybody? Do people tweet? Nobody? Okay, a few people. Right, I mean, as we all know, like the key aspect to like being good at Twitter is you should only tweet about like a quarter of the tweets you write, right? You like type it, you look at it, you're like, and then you delete it, right? That's so I think this aspect of like actually interrogating what you write is certainly applicable to that venue. But that again is also a text venue, so it's like closer to writing books and articles, just shorter. So yeah, I would love to know, I mean, if there are people in the room who work in one of these more visual media who like post TikToks or YouTubes or something like that, I would actually love it if you wanted to come to the mic and be like, did any of what you said resonate with what I need to do to sort of make my stuff effective? Because I truly don't know, and I would love to.
Thank you.
Yeah, David.
Hey, Jordan. Thanks a lot. I'm also somebody who thinks a lot about my writing, and I'm sort of very careful, and I edit other people's and try to make it clearer and so on. One of the things I find, though, is, I mean, I've worked in academia, I've worked in government contracting, I now work at Google, and sometimes I find people are like, why are you telling us a story? You're putting too much of yourself into it. Just like, take it out, give us the whole cold, hard facts. Like, in talks, like, how did you find this? I'm like talking about the story of how I discovered this thing that people want to know. Well, just tell me the answer. So how do you, I mean, I'm getting pushback on it. I mean, maybe I just push back on them, but what are your thoughts about that? When people say, no, you should be more cold and analytical and just give me the answer.
Do you have like a lot of like Vulcans at your work? Like, I don't get it. That's a, sorry, outdated cultural reference for like the young people. But
maybe they just don't, yeah. Maybe they just don't care. They just want the answer. They want to get the answer and move on.
I mean, okay, so here's one cold, hard fact that I've had to learn about writing, like especially if you read your own Goodreads reviews, which you should never do. Like, whatever you do, somebody's not gonna like it.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, somebody's gonna hate it. So I think what I would say to that is simply like, I get that you feel that way, but most people feel the opposite way. Like, I truly feel like that's true, that most people respond well to stories and respond well to narratives, and when they go to a research talk, it helps them engage with it to be like, how did I, the human being in front of you, like get here? And yeah, there are gonna be people who don't wanna hear that, but no matter what you do, there's gonna be people who don't like it, and I think that attitude that you describe is decidedly in the minority from my own experience. So I'm not saying ignore, I mean, I'm not saying ignore it, I'm not saying don't validate it, but just, I think if you follow that advice,
Well,
most people are not gonna like it.
I don't follow it, but anyway.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's move outside. So,
We have another talk coming up, so we're going to have to thank Jordan once again. And those of you with questions can meet him out in the hallway.
yes, awesome.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much.
So yeah, thank you.